I just discovered this sub and would like to discuss a collection of things that happened during my childhood with like-minded individuals. The following will be explained in a scattered way, so I apologise, but I have lots of things I want to talk about that were happening in parallel with each other. A little background. I grew up in rural New Jersey. The house I grew up in was new and was actually built by my parents when they decided they wanted to start a family. The property had previously been old farmland, and most of the area had been largely undisturbed until my parents bought the property and had the house erected. Set far back from everything, we had a long gravel driveway, and some elements of the farm that once resided there remained, such as some very old rusty barbed wire in the wood line and old stone walls that had once marked property lines. This isn't essential to the story, but it will help to paint a picture. When I was 4, my mum gave birth to my brother, who we will call Jake. When I was 6, my mum gave birth to my youngest brother, who we will call Matt. I don't recall having any paranormal experiences at home before Matt was born, and everything seemed normal, until my parents decided to build an extension on the house. This decision was made because we primarily needed another bedroom for Matt, as my parents wanted us to all have our own rooms. They had a construction company come and dig up the yard a bit more to extend the foundation, add on a family room, and add on another bedroom. Matt was finally born and the addition was completed. Being the oldest child, I had dibs, and I was promised the newest room. I finally moved all my stuff into my new room, and this is where things started to change for me. The atmosphere in that room was different from the rest of the house. I felt rather uncomfortable being in there, especially when I was alone. I always had this feeling that someone was standing 2 inches behind me and staring at me. I had this feeling always, without fail, when I was in that room. When I'd want to go to sleep, I'd have to figure out which way I wanted to face, towards the wall or toward the open. I felt vulnerable to whatever I felt watching me if I faced towards the wall, but if I faced towards the open room, I feared opening my eyes and potentially seeing a figure that didn't belong. I tried telling my parents that I didn't feel comfortable, and I ended up sleeping on the floor in either of my brother's rooms from time to time. My parents, though, would have enough and make me go back to my room, so I forced myself to deal with it for a while, trying to play it off. Until one night I heard a thud towards the back of my room. I sat up and looked back, finding that a figurine had fallen to the floor from one of my shelves, and immediately thereafter I heard footsteps creaking across my floor to my bed. I bolted out of there and knew something was up. I spent the next 3 months or so sleeping in my brother's rooms, and my parents let that slide because they'd seen how terrified I was after that night. I was totally afraid to go in my room after that for a while. Also at this time, I'd like to mention that neither my mum nor my maternal grandma were strangers to paranormal activity. My mum especially, since she'd experienced a lot as a child. During this time period, my maternal grandmother came to visit and stayed in my room for a few days, since I wasn't using it. After the last day there, she told my mum in confidence that there was something not right in that room and she didn't feel comfortable at all. She then proceeded to tell my mum about the feeling that she was being constantly watched. My grandmother said she'd never spend a night in that room again. I didn't learn this until years later, but it explains why my mum sort of eased up on me after that visit, and it makes me feel less crazy that someone else experienced it. In addition to being uncomfortable in my room, my grandmother told my mum that while sitting in the family room, she would sometimes see a black figure out of the corner of her eye, going up and down the stairs. My mum told her that she wasn't imagining things, as she would also see a black figure going up and down the steps. I also learned later on from my mum that she would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and see a child figure next to the bed staring at her, and it wasn't any of my brothers or I. She said it used to startle her, but she ended up just ignoring it. Jake acted a little weird around this time too. He was still quite young, but he used to be terrified to go into the bathroom by the stairs, because he said, "There is a man in the wall." Skip ahead a couple of years. Some time had passed and things seemed to have settled down. I had been able to return to my room and felt a little less scared to be in there, but I still kept my head on a swivel. I was glad that things were looking up, but this wouldn't last forever. My parents went through a pretty bitter divorce, and sparing you the details on how we got there, things got nasty for a while. Lots of yelling, screaming, and overall destructive behaviour. The atmosphere of the house became very full of anger, and it wasn't long before something paranormal had returned. Luckily, I spent most of my time living with my mum elsewhere during the divorce, but my brothers and I still had to stay at my dad's every other weekend. Little things started happening, but they were no longer isolated to any one room. Remember the presence I felt in my bedroom some years back after the addition of the extension? Well, that presence came back, but this time I felt it all over the house. I was legitimately afraid to go back there because I didn't feel secure anywhere in the house. But I went anyway because it was the law, being that it was part of the divorce agreement. I witnessed some stuff move on its own, and things turned on by themselves. For instance, I remember being on the first floor by myself late at night when everyone else was sleeping upstairs. I was getting ready to head back up, and the VCR in the family room turned on, along with the surround sound system, and Star Wars resumed where I'd left it. Another day, the record player in the family room had once randomly changed speeds from 33 RPM to 78, so whatever was playing sounded like the Chipmunks version. And lo and behold, I had a Darth Vader lamp in my bedroom that decided it would also like to randomly turn on. This thing must have really liked Star Wars. I couldn't wait for my weekends with my dad to finish, because of these things. The last scary incident I can remember happening to me there was when I was taking a shower. I heard what sounded like a music box right on the other side of the curtain. Of course I looked, and there was nothing there. Eventually things settled down and tensions cooled as time went on. It's been some time now since I've last experienced anything paranormal while visiting my dad. To this day, I believe that the things I experienced in that house were a combination of disturbing the soil and the negative energy introduced during the divorce of my parents. Edit. I did some talking with my mum about all of this, and she said that after my grandmother spent those nights in my room, she described the feeling as pure evil, and she said she'd never wanted to go in there again. Additionally, I should add that my parents were avid collectors of antique things like furniture and tools. When I was around 11 or 12, while living in the same house I live in now, I was great friends with one of the lads that lived a couple of doors up from me. He was a year older, and he was somewhat of a role model at the time, as we were interested in the same things. Every day after school, and during the weekends, I'd go to his house because he had this program called Pivot Stick Figure on his computer. It was basically stop animation software, where you could animate 2D stickmen and draw environments for them to interact with. It was awesome, to be honest, and I've tried to download it again countless times recently. Anyway, it was normal for me to be there for hours, and we'd create these really long, highly detailed animations of stick figures bearing the hell out of each other. I got to know his family pretty well too. There was 3 of them, the mum, her 2 children, her son was my friend and she also had a daughter, and they also had a dog named Alfie, and he was really well trained and behaved. The story kind of revolves around the dog, so I guess that's a really important detail. So the dog had a habit of finding his way over or under fences and through hedges, getting into people's gardens and such. During the summer he'd often find his way into our garden, but our family was cool with it as we all knew the owners and the dog. That's a detail to remember for later, the dog being in our garden. One day I came home from school. I was young, so I was being walked home by my mum, and there was an RSPCA van outside of their house. We stopped to talk to them and see what was going on. Apparently, while the neighbours were walking their dog around the fields nearby, he had run ahead to look at some sheep in a field and gotten his head caught in a barbed wire fence. In his struggle to get out, he cut his head, face and neck up really badly, and he bled out in my friend's mum's arms, which is really sad. Everyone knew the dog, so it was a really sad thing to have happened. I remember all the neighbours buying their family cards about losing their pet. Fast forward a few months, and as usual I'm going to my friend's house to do some animation stuff. We walk in and he runs straight into the living room where the computer was. I took my shoes off at the door and was leaning on a cabinet they had beside the door. When I looked up towards their stairs, which are directly in front of their door, I see the dog sat there looking at me, not moving or anything. Freaked out, I look away and look back, and there's nothing there. My friend's mum can see I'm puzzled and a bit shocked, and I remember her exact words. She asked me, "You all right, mate?" I remember just nodding yes in reply. Later I asked her if they'd already gotten a new dog, to which they said no. So I then told them how I thought I'd seen a dog sat at the top of the stairs when I'd arrived. They just looked at me like I was a weirdo. I forgot about it and didn't really think about it again until one night when I was lying in bed. My bedroom backs onto our back garden, and I could hear our bushes rustling along with the familiar sound of his collar jingling as he jumped into our garden. I was hesitant, but I looked out of my window to again see him sat right in the middle of our garden, just looking up. I have blinds in my room, so I put them down and peeked through the slats. I then went to pull the string to lift up the whole thing, and as I did, he was gone, like nothing had ever happened. Even up until as recent as last year, I'd hear the sound of him coming into our garden, but I haven't heard it since, nor did I bother freaking myself out by looking outside after the first time. They eventually moved away about a year after the dog had died, so there wasn't really anything that I could think of that would have marked the reason for me to stop hearing or seeing the dog. This has been ongoing, with a variety of experiences over 5 years. This is all true from the best of my recollection, and apologies if it seems like a deliberately written story, but I have a minor in English, so it sort of just comes out that way. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1 at the age of 16 in 2012. I don't know if that destroys my credibility, but I may as well disclose it as it factors into some of what's happened. Before I started my sophomore year of college in 2015, I became interested in the law of attraction and that your thoughts and energy can manifest things in your life. I studied it through online articles and even a Reddit community, and I found some success. So much so that I wanted to go a little deeper. I eventually stumbled upon the occult and the concept of sigils, thinking it could be a harmless way to supercharge my LOA manifesting. I carried out a brief, I don't know what to call it, ritual? I'm not going to disclose what I did specifically, but it did not involve harming myself or others, and it didn't take much time or effort. I started school again not long after I used the sigil, and I barely made it through a week of classes before things spiraled downwards. I couldn't sleep at all that first week. It's a common symptom of my condition, but when you're fully medicated and not missing any doses like I was at the time, it shouldn't be happening. On the Friday of that first week, I went into my economics class to find that a girl I had befriended a year earlier was teaching the class that day because the professor was out sick. It didn't make any sense. She was a finance major, and she was only a year older than me. Why her, and not another professor or a real TA or GA? Another strange thing was that she was dressed like she was about to go out to the club, in a short black miniskirt, stiletto heels and a tight white blouse. We had a history of flirting since we'd known each other, so after class we struck up a conversation, and in a matter of minutes we'd made plans to get dinner later and hang out at her apartment afterwards. We'd met a year earlier in a weird core class that focused on love, relationships, and communication under religious subtext. The class was taught by a monk, as I went to a Catholic university. After I got her number, I walked out of the classroom, and out of nowhere I snapped into a sort of weird, fugu state. What happened over the course of the next 12 hours is a blur, but I wandered in circles on foot through the city of Pittsburgh, all through the late afternoon and into the night, until the police found me around dawn, barefoot in a suburb south of the city. My parents had filed a missing persons report. I was living with my aunt in the city at the time, and they'd all panicked when I was nowhere to be found, with my car still at my aunt's. A while after this, I tried to reconstruct the path that I had taken from what I remembered on Google Earth, and it didn't make any sense. I'd walked about 35 miles in total, and on foot, and I ended up well south of the city in a time span that just didn't add up. My parents were understandably worried, and because of my history with bipolar, they took me to a clinic located in the Oakland neighborhood of Pittsburgh. I signed myself in voluntarily. It took hours for me to get registered, and by the time I got up to my room, it was well into the early hours of the morning. Something about the place was really unnatural, and I heard some really bizarre noises throughout the nights I was there. The next morning I woke up, and standing in the doorway to my room staring at me was one of the milieu therapists. She was wearing glasses and her hair was straightened, which made her look a little different. And then I read her name tag. It was the same girl that I'd made plans with just a day or two earlier. Same name and everything. I'll call her Mary. She invited me to get up and come join her for group therapy. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, I explained to the doctors everything that had happened to me, and I had my meds adjusted. The docs figured that my sleep cycle disruption and the stress of school was to blame. Mary was there throughout, leading therapy sessions, and we spent a lot of time talking. "Don't I know you?" I kept insisting, but she just laughed about it. "We might have met," she admitted after a while. The night before I was discharged, I heard a violent knocking on my door, and it went on for a long time before the door finally opened, and a hand reached through the void and groped aimlessly along the wall before the door slammed shut. The next morning I asked the staff why they had woken me up. The night shift nurse was just getting ready to leave, and she said no such thing had happened, but they looked noticeably spooked when I asked them about this. While all this was happening, my grandmother was losing her battle with lung cancer, and within a week of being discharged from the hospital, I watched her pass away in agony. After she died, one of my aunts announced that my cousin from Seattle was coming to the funeral. I was sitting on the back porch at my grandma's house when she showed up. I hadn't seen my cousin Katie since I was 12. I'd only briefly met her for a week in 2008, and I had no real memory of her. She rushed around the corner and hugged me tightly, rocking back and forth and exclaiming how much she had missed me. She wouldn't let go, and my initial reaction was, "What the hell? I don't even know you. What are you doing?" And that's when she took a step back, and my blood ran cold. I'd only been out of the hospital for a few days, so there was no way I could have made a mistake. It was Mary. Over the next couple of days, we went to the viewings for my grandmother and the funeral itself. I have other female cousins around my age, and none of them have ever acted anything like how Mary acted. I won't go into the details, but things between us were sexually charged, and it almost got out of hand. At the last second, I came to my senses before we went all the way. I called her out the night before she left. "We just saw each other. What are you doing here? I know it's you, Mary." "Oh yeah?" she laughed. "That's funny." Katie left after the funeral was done. I had a picture of myself and her together, and I compared it to Mary's picture on her Facebook. I even showed a friend I trusted, and he saw the resemblance. A little while after this, Mary deleted all of her social media, and there wasn't a trace of her left anywhere online. I tried texting her, but there was no answer. It's like she never existed. I found Katie online and I added her, but her profiles were empty, with only 1 or 2 pictures. I checked back a few days later, and suddenly there was hundreds of pictures. She'd been everywhere. Burning Man, Coachella, Israel, the pyramids. Apparently she'd even had a degree from a university in Switzerland, according to her Facebook bio. She had mentioned none of this to me when we met. A couple of years passed uneventfully after all this. I had some strange encounters in Pittsburgh's South Side on some late nights after the bars closed. I got lost in the back streets one night during a heavy rainstorm and thought I was being followed, but nothing else other than that really stood out. That was until my last semester of college in 2018. I got slammed in all my classes. I was a history major, and it seemed like everything I was learning about focused exclusively on rape, genocide and pestilence, etc. The course material was incredibly violent and disturbing, and I started to crack. I turned to religion, and somehow I managed enough free time to tear through the Bible in about 3 weeks. But in the meantime, the memory of the sigils started to gnaw at me, so I started to go to church. I was never particularly religious, but I found comfort in going to Mass. However, though, I grew disgusted with the Catholics because of the sex abuse scandal and wound up drawn to Eastern Orthodoxy. Near the end of the semester, I took a medical withdrawal citing stress, and I spent the summer regaining my senses and spending time with my family. That fall, I resumed my studies and found myself in the library one day looking for a book about dream studies. I was looking into it because I had some bizarre vivid dreams around that time. I found the book, and that's when I stumbled upon rows of books about parapsychology, Satanism, witchcraft, the occult, astral projection, you name it. I ventured further into the library and found texts about sexual deviancy, violent psychosis, and handbooks for hypnosis complete with diagrams and instructions. I thought to myself, what in God's name is a Catholic school doing with all these awful books? The next morning I decided to go ask one of the priests at the campus chapel how he felt about all the satanic texts sitting in the library. I was sort of outraged, and I just wanted to get some perspective. After waiting for a few minutes, the priest in charge of the campus ministry sat down to talk with me. I asked him what all the sick stuff in the library was for, and he said he had no idea it was there. We talked for a while before he finally told me a story about how, as a young man on a mission trip, he had encountered a demon and saw it with his own eyes. He described that demon to me. Well, it was just my luck that I had seen something like what he'd described just a few nights before in a nightmare, and I didn't know if this was a coincidence, but a few months later I graduated and happily got the hell away from that school. Before I met my cousin in 2015, I heard barely a whisper spoken about her. My grandmother never mentioned her, and neither did any of my aunts or parents, even though she was my first cousin. She never visited when my grandmother was sick, and aside from her visit in 2008, it was like she came out of nowhere. Not long after the funeral in 2015, I went back to my aunt's house where I had been staying before. That's when I noticed pictures of Katie throughout the house. They were in the dining room, on the mantel, and there was even one where my picture and Katie's picture were placed side by side in the same frame. It was freaky, because I didn't remember any of those pictures being there before, and I had lived there for over a year, with only being gone for a few weeks. I didn't speak a word about it to my aunt and just kind of brushed it off. Not long after that, though, I started finding pictures of her at home in my parents' house, tucked away in some drawers. Katie and I still text from time to time. She uses a lot of hearts and says she loves me, even more than girls I've dated. It's incredibly confusing. She's my cousin. It's disgusting. But somehow I'm still drawn to her. I never heard from Mary again. I search for her online every once in a while, but there's no record of her anywhere. About every other week I have vivid dreams that Katie and I are together. My life was relatively unassuming before I discovered Sigil, but since 2015 it's been one thing after another. I think that when I carried out the Sigil back in 2015, I stirred up some kind of entity that inserted itself into my life and backdated onto my timeline. Until 2015, it's like she was never even there, and then all of a sudden, here's your beautiful first cousin that nearly seduces you just a few days after you've met for basically the first time. I'm back at my old school again, working on a paralegal certificate while working at a law firm. Or I was, until the coronavirus outbreak. Sometimes I swear that I've seen her in passing these past few months. I'm not going to name my school, but if you're curious, Google what the #1 Catholic university is in Pittsburgh. You'll find it. I'm not the only one who's had weird experiences there either. It was 1988, 3 a.m., and I was alone except for my dog, and was sound asleep. I suddenly heard 3 very loud knocks on my door, which was right next to my bed. I woke up and bounded to the door in 3 steps. My dog was already at the door in alert mode and listening intently. I looked out through the peephole in the door, expecting to see a cop, but there was nothing there. Then I remembered that my door is inside a gated courtyard with 6 feet high brick walls, and the gate was locked. No one could have run off without being seen or heard climbing the gate. Later in 2005, at 4 a.m., my 22-year-old son was home from college, and I am awakened by 3 loud knocks again. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, so I got up and checked out the house. But again, nothing. Later that morning my son got up and asked, "Did you hear those 3 knocks last night?" "Yeah," I replied. "It's the second time I've heard knocks around 3 a.m. I spoke to a respected psychic once, and she said that it was your grandpa checking on you, and that he looks like you." My mother died in 2011, and in 2014 I dreamt that I'd seen her face against a black background, and she said, "You're going to need a bigger patio." I woke up suddenly and said to myself, "Wow, that was so real." And I went about my day thinking about the experience. 2 weeks later, my son called me and asked if he could store some weightlifting equipment at my house. I said it was okay, and he said he was on his way over with it. He arrived with 2 friends in a large flatbed truck loaded with equipment. They unloaded the equipment onto my back patio, completely covering it. I watched as they filled the last remaining space on the patio, and I remembered the dream and instantly understood its meaning. My mum was just letting me know that she still exists. At the age of 10, it was summer, and I was home alone. It was around 6 p.m. and I was watching TV. Suddenly, a stack of books on a shelf above my bed shot off and landed in the middle of my bedroom. Now back to me as an adult. It was 2 a.m. and I couldn't sleep. I didn't want to disturb my wife, so I went to sit on the couch in the front room in the dark. The couch faces a fireplace with a TV in front of it. I was looking in the direction of the TV, and behind me is the doorway into the hallway, which leads to a bathroom to the left and our bedroom to the right. As I'm sitting there in darkness, I noticed movement of a reflection on the black TV screen. I focused on the movement, and it looked like the reflection of a woman dressed in a white gown, moving left and right in the dark hallway door opening, just back and forth towards the bathroom and then towards the bedroom. I watched this for about half an hour and would look behind me in the hallway and see nothing, but when I looked back at the TV, there was the white apparition floating back and forth. I eventually got bored and went back to bed. Another time I was babysitting my 4-year-old granddaughter. She has a DVD with old Disney Christmas shows that she wanted to watch. One of the old shows from 1953 came on, and there was an old-fashioned band playing. My granddaughter said, "I used to watch this with all of my cousins." This went on for weeks, and I didn't say anything. Her mum told me that my granddaughter also said the same thing at her other grandparents' house. Finally, the next time it came up, I said to my granddaughter, "But you only have one cousin." My granddaughter replied that she had more cousins. So I asked, "Where are they?" She looked at me and pointed her index finger up at the ceiling. I said, "Why are they here?" "They protect me. They keep me safe," she replied. "Why can't I see them?" I asked. "They're hiding," she said. My maternal great-grandmother told me a story about my mum during World War II, when my dad was in the Army Air Corps. With the war on, my mum lived with and shared a bedroom with her grandmother. One night my grandmother said that my mum had sat up in bed and said, "Oh my God, his airplane just broke in half and it's going down." Some days after my mum's vision, my dad called my mum and told her that was on a training flight in a Lockheed Hudson bomber over Georgia. He was in the tail of the airplane when the tail broke off. He was able to parachute safely, but the rest of the crew in the front of the airplane couldn't get out and died. Both of my maternal grandparents died in October 1956, when I was about 8 years old. Months later, when I was at school, the bell rang for recess, and I skipped playing with my friends to instead walk out to the farthest extent of the playground to an old baseball diamond. I was just hanging out there, playing with the chain-link fence around the dugout. The bell rang to end recess, and I just ignored it. A few minutes passed while I just continued ignoring that it was time to return to class. And at that moment I heard my grandfather's, My grandfather's deep, low voice, as loud and clear as if it were right next to me, and he said, "You better go in, son." Ever since I could remember, I have never truly been religious, but I have always believed in spirits. I believe I've witnessed them at different times, starting from some of my first memories to now, and I really like to talk about my experiences because I think it's fascinating, though I'm not completely sure what it really is. When I was in 6th grade, I went to my friend's house to get ready for a football game, and she had told me ahead of time that an old lady had died in her house. She told me to not be disrespectful in any way, because there's been a few times that people have talked badly about the old lady and had been pushed down the stairs. Her mum even ended up breaking her leg because she'd said something rude about the ghost and told me she'd felt like she'd been shoved down the stairs when the only person home with her was on the main floor already. I remember sitting on her bed with her bedroom door to my left, open, and her to my right, sitting next to me. I felt like someone was watching me. And when I got this weird tingly feeling through my body, my friend pointed to her older box-style TV and said she was here. I looked up and saw a dark shadow standing in the bedroom doorway. My instant reaction to this was to invite it over, because I didn't want the ghost to think I was being rude or for it to harm me. So I said, "Hey girl, you know you can come sit with us." Then to the left of me on the bed, it dipped in like someone was sitting on it. Fast forward to after the game, and my friend asked me to stay the night, so I said I would. I couldn't sleep at all that night as I kept feeling like someone was watching me. It was really unnerving, so I ended up staying awake all night and left the next morning after she woke up. The following Monday I asked her if anything weird had happened during the rest of the weekend, but she told me that nothing had happened since the night I'd stayed. Then I started noticing little things happening in my room, like things moving slightly out of place. I tried not to think too much into it though. Fast forward to my freshman year of high school. I was sure that there was something following me, but I wanted more proof. Yes, I had seen things happen throughout the years, but I figured it was just a different spirit in the house I had moved to. I was talking to my grandma one day, and she told me that when she woke up in the night, she would frequently see a shadow standing outside of my bedroom door, or she would see it walking into her closet. The wall that separated our rooms had her closet and mine in parallel. My mum always told me that my grandma was making things up just to scare me, but I wanted more proof, and I wasn't sure how to get it. One night my friend came over to stay, and the only person home was my grandma. She was asleep on the 2nd floor of the house I was living in, and my friend and I were in the kitchen getting something to drink. I didn't want to leave the kitchen just yet because I kept hearing heavy footsteps in the living room, and I was getting scared. The dogs that were standing by the living room started barking and freaking out. It was really late, so I started to walk around the corner to tell them to stop barking, when I froze. I could see a dark shadow standing between the dogs' cages. I stayed perfectly still, except for my eyes that were scanning around me. I started blinking rapidly to see if my eyes were messing with me, but it just stood there until I screamed and ran back into the kitchen. When I looked back, it wasn't there, and the dogs were no longer barking. So right then and there I figured I would give it a name, because yes, I was terrified when I saw it, but it felt almost familiar to me, like I had known it my entire life. I figured that if it wanted to harm me, it would have by now, as it's had 3 years to. In fact, any time I'd had a really harsh day, like a fight with my father, or something made me really upset and ready to cry, I would feel something playing with my hair in a comforting way. I decided I'd call it Ghosty, and I concluded that it was the old lady, because nothing had ever happened before I'd stayed the night at my friend's house back in the 6th grade. Before I met my current boyfriend, I had gone with some friends to an abandoned asylum, 45 minutes away from my house. Before I left, I asked Ghosty to watch over me and keep me safe during the experience. I was actually told afterwards by the person who drove us there that he would never take me there again because he had been there more than 5 times and had never experienced anything like what he did when I was there. Afterwards, when I got home, I was talking to my cousin about everything, when I felt something grab my leg. It felt like long, sharp nails before I could feel any skin. Now I know I wasn't imagining it, because a year later I told my current boyfriend about it, but left out the part of the nails. One day my boyfriend said he didn't believe me about Ghosty, because he'd never witnessed anything, and within 10 minutes he climbed on my bed, pulling a blanket over him, and said he felt something grab his leg. I whispered, messing with him, "Did you feel her long sharp nails first before her hand?" I have never seen him so scared. He said, "How did you know?" I still occasionally have experiences with who I think is Ghosty. It would now be a little over 6 years since the night that I stayed at my friend's house, which makes me wonder, have other people ever experienced anything like this before? This happened when I was really little, around 3 or 5 years old, but I still remember it quite vividly because it really creeped me out. I used to stay with my auntie during the weekdays and only go back to my parents during weekends, as both of them were working and my auntie was a housewife. I was drinking out of milk bottles until I was around 7, and my auntie would always prepare milk for me before going to bed. We lived in a 3-bedroom apartment, and every night before bedtime, my auntie would switch off all the lights in the house, except the bedroom lights, and before I'd go to bed she would walk from our room to the kitchen, through the living room, with no lights on, prepare my milk in a bottle, and go back to the bedroom. 3 out of 5 times I would either follow behind her or be piggybacked to the kitchen. I don't remember when I started seeing the eye on the wall, but for that period of time I would see the eye all the time at night, as we'd walk through our living room. Back then I actually thought that it was nothing out of the ordinary. It was always just one eye, not a pair, just like a really big eye on the wall. I would see it really clearly, although no lights were on, almost like it was glowing, and it even blinked at times. The eye would be in the same spot every time and would follow us as we moved. For a long while I didn't tell or ask anyone about it, as I thought it was normal. Don't know why. It was weird, but I guess I didn't feel evil or harm from it. Then at one point I casually asked my aunt about the eye on the wall, as I wondered why she'd never paid any attention to it, as I would often stare back at it. And I kid you not, she didn't know what I was talking about. So I waited until nighttime came, got piggybacked through the living room with my aunt again, and that time I pointed the eye out and told her to look, as it was right there, and it had been almost every night. I guess my auntie freaked out a little on the inside and told me there was nothing there and to stop spouting nonsense. After that I realized that no one could see the eye except for me. I got scared and I would seldom follow my aunt to the kitchen anymore, but when I did I would shut my own eyes and cling on to her, taking quick peeks. I don't know when, but the eye just stopped appearing and I slowly forgot about it until I was 12. My classmates were talking about scary stories and experiences, which prompted me to remember this. Throughout the years I have tried Googling to see if anyone else has had the same experience, but so far I've found nothing. I have asked friends of different cultures as well, and still nothing. The closest I've heard are of a glowing pair of eyes in the dark, but never just one eye on the wall. Before we get started, I should explain something about my past. I never really had any friends when I was younger. I was a good kid, I would say. I had good grades, a good family, and I wasn't bothered by the fact of being alone, or so I thought. When I was younger, I can only recall a few times when I experienced something paranormal. The first time was in Walmart. I remember standing in line and looking up at a woman who was in a beautiful dark red dress, but she didn't have any legs. In my strange 5-year-old mind, I thought to myself, wow, she must be super strong. I pointed at her and told my dad to look at the strong lady. He then told me it was rude to point at bald people. The man who was in front of the lady I was looking at was bald. I don't know what it was that I witnessed, still to this day. I always tried to brush it off and say to myself that it was just my imagination, but she always comes up in my mind. The next time was when I was 7 years old. I was walking in the woods, playing with my stuffed monkey. This was when my dad was young and the woods were safer, and I saw this thing. It was just this black outline of what I would hope was a human, but it was like a shadow. I looked at it and it looked back at me. I stared for what seemed like a freaking century until it came up to me. I have no idea why I wasn't scared, but I asked it to play with me. So for the next 3 hours I ran all through the woods and played with this thing. It could even interact with objects. It was able to pick up my toy monkey. It was such a strange day, but I went home very happy and told my dad all about it. He said it was just my imagination, so that's what I led myself to believe. But not so long ago I started to have these dreams. In the dreams I was in the woods, and there was a little creek and a log that I would sit on. It had glowing flowers and mushrooms and more stars than you could even imagine. Every time I had these dreams, I'd know I was dreaming, but I could feel everything. I will admit that at first time I was very scared, because this man came to me. He would just talk to me about my day though, and he was never a threat. He wore a black suit and had a golden pocket watch. He looked somewhat like my dad, having brown eyes and dark brown hair that faded slightly, being lighter in the front. I had these dreams every Monday, Wednesday and Sunday. It was nice. I looked forward to them. Then I started to wonder, who was this guy really? I decided I was going to ask him. So on Sunday I carefully brought it into conversation. Hey, speaking of that, what's your story? He looked at me with confusion. What do you mean, darling? He said, looking at his watch. I mean, what's your story? Who are you? I watched him as he struggled to answer. Oh, come on, Goldie. This is what I named him since he didn't tell me his name, and well, he had a golden watch I would often take from him. I think it's best for that to stay a secret, he said as he stood up. Oh, okay then. I guess you don't have the best past, eh? I said, walking over to him. He gave me a weak smile. Yeah. Sorry, he said while holding up his watch. It is time for you to go. See you soon. Then everything started to fade. I woke up and I tried to find everything I could about him. He looked like he was in his 20s, and if he was a ghost, he probably died in the 1940s, or somewhere around then, remembering how his suit looked. I was so desperate to find out who he really was. So being the 12-year-old that I am, I decided I would bug him until I got something. Hey, Goldie, what's your name? I said, upside down on the tree next to the log. It's Goldie, he said. No, your real name. He rolled his eyes. I don't have one, he replied. I'll save you the time and say the next 50 lines would be me asking his name and him not giving it to me. About 2 weeks ago I thought I saw something in the parking lot when I took my dog out for potty. I couldn't be sure, but I thought it was him, and to my surprise it was. Monday came and he asked, Why didn't you come over when I was there? Now I was sure this guy must be real. The next morning I kept thinking that what if something was wrong with me? Why am I seeing this guy? I for sure knew I didn't want to tell my dad, as he says because of my mum's death that I needed a therapist. I keep trying to make myself believe none of this is real, and maybe I'm just being a stupid little kid, but he just keeps coming back. Yesterday I thought that maybe I'm not crazy. I told him to follow me and I walked past my dad, and I said, Hey Dad. And he just said hi back. I knew he would have freaked if he'd seen Goldie. I'm researching and I think maybe he was a criminal though. I don't know, but it's just a feeling I'm getting. For the time being I only see him while I'm awake from times around 4:30 till I fall asleep. I'll make sure to update if anything new or odd happens.